The night I first saw her, I was standing at the edge of the northern tree line with snow settling on my shoulders and my breath ghosting white into the cold, watching a wolf that had not let any living creature within 50 paces of it for 30 years. Ashenmoor's moon wolf was older than my father's reign, older than the stone hall we had built against the mountain's face, older than the treaty lines our great-grandfathers had drawn across the valley. It was not simply a wolf. It was the bond light of our line, the living embodiment of the sacred tie between an alpha of Ashenmoor and the land itself, a creature woven from moonlight and the old promise that said, "So long as the wolf walks, the pack endures, and the alpha's heart is true." Every king before me had been able to call it by name. Every king before me had placed a hand on its great pale flank and felt the warmth run through both of them, wolf to king, king to wolf, a circle of devotion as reliable as the seasons. My father had been the last. When my mother died, struck down by a fever in the 3rd week of winter, 30 years passed, the moonwolf had walked out of the great hall on a night so still that no one heard it go. My father had followed it to the tree line. He had spoken its name, and the wolf had simply looked at him with those pale silver eyes and then turned and moved deeper into the forest, and had not come close to a human hand since. We did not know then that my father would be dead within the year. The healers said it was a wasting illness. I was 12 years old, standing at his bedside, and I believed them. But I had grown older and understood things differently. A man whose bond light goes dark does not always survive it. The moonwolf had not killed my father, but the grief had, and the wolf had simply known, before any of us did, that the tie it had been woven to represent was broken. I became Alpha King of Ashenmoor at 13, under a regency that lasted 5 years and left me with the crown, the stone hall, the pack of 4,000 souls, and a moon wolf that circled the northern forest like a wound no one could close. My council had learned to speak around it. In 30 years of my reign, they had proposed every solution they could imagine. Send the most gifted trackers to coax it in, set food at the tree line, consult the old moon seers in the eastern settlements, cull it and put an end to the omen. I had refused every proposal that involved force or harm, and ignored every proposal that involved coaxing, because I had tried those myself. In my 20th year as king, I had walked into that forest alone, called the wolf's moon name, and stood there in the cold until my feet went numb. The wolf had circled me at a distance of 60 paces, close enough for me to hear it breathe, and it had not come nearer. I walked out again just before dawn, no closer to the answer than when I went in. My council took this as proof that the bond light was simply gone, that Ashenmoor's sacred tie had severed with my mother's death and would not return. Some of the older advisors began to say, in careful voices, that perhaps the absence of the wolf's light explained why I had not yet found a true mate, that the thread connecting the alpha's heart to his destined bond partner required the moonwolf's blessing to complete, that without it, the mate mark would never fully ignite. I listened to them. I did not agree, but in the quiet of my own rooms, in the hours before dawn when I let myself be honest, I was not certain they were wrong. The night I first saw her, I had come to the northern tree line not because of any plan or strategy, but because I could not sleep. I had stood there, watching the wolf move between the pines at a distance, its pale coat catching what little moonlight came through the cloud cover, and I had simply let myself be still. I was not calling it. I was not coaxing. I was only watching. And then I heard a sound from outside the tree line, from the direction of the old grove, a piece of land on Ashenmoor's northern boundary that the pack used for nothing in winter, a quiet quarter-mile of silver birch and sleeping herb beds where the keeper's cottage sat. It was not a threatening sound. It was, in fact, very small. Someone was singing. The voice was low and unhurried, not a performance but the kind of singing a person does when they believe no one can hear them, a melody without words, or rather, with words I did not recognize, in an older syllable set that I could not immediately place. The moonwolf stopped moving. I had not seen the moonwolf stop moving in 30 years. It turned its great head toward the sound. Its ears came up. Its tail, which I had only ever seen carried low, moved once to the side, a slow, uncertain arc, as if testing a muscle it had forgotten it possessed. I held my breath and did not move. The wolf stood there for a long moment, listening, and then it took 3 steps toward the grove and stopped again. I moved back behind a stand of pines so that the shadow covered me fully, and I watched. The voice continued. It did not hurry, did not break off, did not do anything unusual. It simply went on, steady and warm, threading through the cold air between the trees. After another long pause, the moonwolf sat down in the snow at the tree line. It did not cross out of the forest, but it sat and it faced the grove, and it did not move away. I stood there in the cold for 2 more hours. When the singing finally stopped and the cottage light went out, the wolf rose and retreated deeper into the trees. I went back to the stone hall and lay awake until morning, thinking. I did not go down to the grove the next day. I sent one of my younger council members, a careful, unobtrusive man named Edric, to learn what he could about the keeper without disturbing her. He came back in the late afternoon with a brief report. A woman, alone, who had arrived in Ashenmoor's borderlands approximately 3 weeks earlier, during the first real cold snap of the season. She had presented at the border registry as a traveling grove keeper, an itinerant trade, old and respected in the northern territories, a person who tended land that a settled community could not spare the hands for in winter. She had given a name. She carried a registered keeper's token from the Eastern Settlement Authority. She had paid the border levy and been assigned the Northern Grove cottage for the season, as it was empty, and the standard arrangement for traveling keepers was a season's lodging in exchange for the grove's maintenance. There was nothing unusual in any of it. Traveling keepers were not uncommon. The Northern Grove was legitimately vacant. The arrangement was routine. She was simply a woman doing the work she had been hired to do, in a cottage she had every right to occupy, on the outer edge of a territory she had paid to enter. And somehow, in 3 weeks of walking a half-mile of birch trees and herb beds at the edge of Ashenmoor's most restricted land, she had done what 30 years of trained trackers and gifted wolf handlers and desperate kings had not. She had made the moonwolf sit down and listen. I told Edric to say nothing of this to the council. He looked at me with the particular expression of a man who understood that he was being asked to do something unusual, and who trusted me enough not to ask why, and he nodded and went. That night I went to the tree line again. The wolf was already there when I arrived. It was sitting in the same place as the night before, in the snow just inside the tree line's edge, facing the grove. The cottage window was lit, and I could hear faintly, carried on the wind, the same unhurried melody. I settled in behind the pines. I watched. The wolf sat, and its tail moved again in that slow, cautious arc, and its ears stayed up. And for the second time in 30 years, it looked like something other than a creature in grief. I stood there until the light went out. The wolf stayed longer this time, another hour after the singing stopped, sitting in the snow in the dark. Then it rose and moved away through the trees, and I walked home in the cold feeling something I could not immediately name. It was not hope, quite. It was something quieter than hope, more careful. The way a man feels when he has seen one thread of a knot loosen for the first time, and does not yet dare to believe the whole thing will come free. On the 3rd night I did not go to the tree line. I had a council meeting in the morning, a border dispute in the afternoon, and 3 hours of correspondence to clear before I could even think of sleep. I was in my study at the 2nd hour past midnight when Edric knocked on my door, which was unusual enough at that hour that I called him in immediately. His expression was something between alarm and wonder. "My lord," he said, "the moon wolf has left the forest." I was out of my chair before he finished the sentence. The story came out as we walked. Edric had been near the northern courtyard when one of the night watchmen sent word that the wolf had crossed the tree line. Not toward the hall, not toward the pack settlement, toward the grove. It had crossed the cleared ground between the forest and the birch trees in the open, under the full visibility of 2 watchmen on the north wall who were, according to Edric, standing with their mouths open and their hands on their signals, and absolutely no idea what to do. The wolf had not been on cleared ground in anyone's living memory. The standing order for if the wolf ever moved toward pack structures was a careful 3-horn sequence and a gentle retreat, no pursuit, no interference. The watchmen had correctly done nothing at all. The wolf had gone into the grove. That was all they knew. I told Edric to keep the watchmen at their posts and not to raise a general alarm. Then I went to the northern courtyard myself, moving quickly and quietly, and I crossed the cleared ground toward the grove alone. The birch trees were pale in the moonlight. The snow between them was unbroken except for 2 sets of tracks, one set belonging to a large wolf, moving with the characteristic unhurried sureness of an animal that knows exactly where it is going, and one set belonging to a person, lighter, narrower, the prints of someone moving through their own familiar ground without urgency, as if they had stepped outside simply to look at the stars. I followed both sets of tracks deeper into the grove. I found them at the old stone well at the grove's center, a landmark so long unused that it had grown a cap of snow over its wooden cover, the rope half frozen on its wheel. She was standing beside it. The moon wolf was 3 paces in front of her. I stopped between the birch trees and did not move. She was not tall. She wore a plain wool working cloak over a healer's dress, the kind of heavy serviceable clothing that a person who spends their days outdoors wears not for appearance but for warmth, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, darkened by the cold air to a deep ash brown. She was not looking at me. She did not know I was there. She was looking at the wolf. Her hands were at her sides. She had not raised them toward the wolf. She was simply standing and looking at it, with an expression on her face that I can only describe, even now, as recognition, not surprise, not fear, not the careful stillness of a person trying not to startle an animal, but something older and quieter than any of those things. The look of someone seeing a thing they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. The wolf looked back at her. Its pale silver eyes were steady. It had not lowered its head or submitted. It was simply present and watching in a way that it had never been present near another human being in the 30 years since my father came to this tree line and was turned away. Then she said something. I could not hear it clearly. The wind had shifted and her voice was low, but I could hear the shape of it. The syllable set was the same archaic one I had heard threaded through her singing, the old moon speech that the Eastern settlement's oldest keepers still used, that our pack scholars kept in records, and our moonseer had died 20 years ago without passing fully on. She spoke 3 words, and then she was quiet again. The wolf took 1 step toward her. I was so still that I was barely breathing. It took another step, then another, until it was close enough to touch. And then it lowered its great head slowly, with a deliberateness that struck me somewhere deep in the chest, because this was not the submissive lowering of a creature that had been cornered or trained. This was the conscious, chosen bow of something ancient and dignified, something that knew exactly what it was doing, and it rested its head in her outstretched hands. She had raised her hands at some point in that last approach. I had not seen it happen. They were simply there, cupped open at the level of her waist, and the wolf's broad forehead came to rest between her palms, and she was still, and the wolf was still, and then something happened that I had not expected and had not planned for and could not have prepared for even if I had known. A light began in the wolf's coat. Not fire, not the sudden blaze of a signal torch or the sharp flare of a mark igniting, nothing violent or sudden. It was slow, the way dawn is slow, the way warmth comes back to frozen fingers held near a hearth. It began in the place where her hands touched the wolf's face and spread outward through the pale fur, a soft silver blue that was the precise color of moonlight on still water, and as it spread the wolf made a sound that I had never in my life heard from it. A low, resonant sound from deep in its chest. Not a howl, not a whimper, but something between the two. A sound that seemed to carry a quantity of held grief, and held longing, and held quiet that I would have needed more words than I have to fully describe. I pressed my back against the birch tree behind me, because a warmth had started in the center of my own chest that I did not understand, spreading outward the way the light was spreading through the wolf's coat, and I understood in that instant, with the clarity of something known at a level beneath thought, that what I was watching was not simply an old wolf responding to a kind hand. This was what my father had told me about, what the old moon seers had written about in the records my scholars kept in careful order in the archive room. The bond light, not just the wolf's, the whole circle of it, the living tie between the moon wolf and the alpha's line, and the one the wolf recognized as belonging to both. The warmth in my chest said, with a certainty I could not argue with, she is the reason the light has been waiting. I stayed behind the birch trees and did not move for a long time. When the wolf's light was fully burning, when the grove was washed in silver blue, when the old stone well and the birch trunks and the snow around them were all lit as if by a moon that had come down from the sky and settled among us, she finally moved. She ran her hand slowly along the wolf's jaw, the way a person touches something that has been hurt and is now, for the first time, being gentled. The wolf pressed into her hands. She spoke again in the old moon speech, softly, nothing I could fully parse, but the tone of it was clear enough. A warmth, a steadiness, a greeting that was also a kind of apology for the years of absence. I did not know how she knew any of this. I did not know how a borderland grove keeper who had arrived in Ashenmore 3 weeks ago with a season's work token and a registered trade name could speak the moon speech, or could speak it well enough to say the wolf's true name in a form that it recognized, or could stand in a dark grove at the second hour past midnight and hold a 30-year grief in her open hands without flinching. I knew only that she had. I left the grove as quietly as I had come and went back to the stone hall with the silver-blue light behind me and that warmth still burning in my chest, and I sat in my study until the sky went pale and did not sleep at all. In the morning I called no one. I cleared my correspondence alone and let the council believe the moonwolf sighting on the north wall had been a watchman's nervous exaggeration, which they were happy enough to believe. I went down to the archive room and pulled the oldest volumes, the moon speech records, the keeper histories, the accounts of the bond light's properties, and I read until midday. What I found in the oldest of the keeper histories was this. The moonwolf's bond light could not be compelled or coaxed back into being by any force or skill. It would wait, the text said, until the one it recognized arrived. And the recognition was not of bloodline or title or trained skill. It was of something the old scholars called true thread, a quality of the heart, a patient and genuine attentiveness to living things, that the wolf's nature was built to find. The wolf would know true thread by instinct, the text said, the way water knows where to run. And where the moonwolf's bond light returned, the alpha's own mate thread would follow, because the wolf and the alpha's destined bond were woven from the same original source. It was the kind of passage that my scholars had marked as poetic, and my council had always dismissed as old mythology. Reading it now, with the warmth still present in my chest and the memory of that silver-blue light fresh in my mind, I did not dismiss it. I also found, in a smaller volume bound in water-stained leather that I had never opened before, a section on true moon speech, the old syllable set of the keepers, which was not a constructed language but a preserved one, passed through generations of traveling grove keepers who had maintained the sacred groves near wolf pack territories since before any of the current pack kingdoms had existed. The section noted that the moonwolf's true name was not known to most alpha kings. It had been passed down through the keeper lineages, not the royal ones, because the original covenant between wolf and pack had been brokered not by kings but by keepers. It was the keepers who had first called the wolf in from the wild. It was the keepers who had held the thread. I put the book down and sat with that for a while. Then I went to find her. And here is where I made the mistake, the one I have had to answer for many times since, and that I will readily answer for again, because the fault was entirely mine, and the consequence of it was nearly the worst thing I have ever caused. I did not go myself. I should have. I went instead to Edric, and I told him to have her brought to the hall for an audience. Edric, who was scrupulous and by the book, and who knew that I had specifically not told the council about the Grove events, interpreted this as a formal summons in the ordinary administrative sense. And Edric did not know what had happened in the Grove. He knew only that the Alpha King wanted to speak with the borderland keeper who had been assigned the Northern Grove cottage, and he had no reason to treat that as anything other than routine. He sent 2 council stewards. The senior of the 2 was a man named Korath, a man I had inherited from my father's Regency Council and had never managed to fully remove, because he was technically competent and politically careful, and had the support of 3 other senior advisors, and removing him would have cost me a fight I had not yet judged worth having. Korath was not a cruel man. He was a man of order. And in his view, order meant categories, and categories meant that a traveling grove keeper with no pack name and no standing in Ashenmoor's formal registry was a borderland laborer with a seasonal work token, and borderland laborers with seasonal work tokens were not escorted to the Alpha King's Hall for personal audiences. They were assigned tasks and dismissed when their task was complete, and if any question had arisen about the Northern Grove cottage or its current occupant, the appropriate response was a council review, not a king's summons. I was told later, much later, when I had the full story, that Korath had spoken to her at the cottage door with the polite, efficient dismissiveness of a man who had made a unilateral decision about what the appropriate outcome of this situation was before the conversation began. He had reviewed her token. He had noted that 3 weeks of the 4-week season had elapsed. He had pointed out that the Northern Grove was technically within the restricted boundary of Ashenmoor's pack land, a classification that the seasonal keeper assignments had apparently been crossing for years without formal review, and that, in his view, the matter ought to be regularized. He had told her that her token would be honored for the remainder of the season at a different grove, a perfectly good grove 2 miles south of the northern boundary, outside the restricted land, and that she was welcome to continue her work there. The Northern Grove cottage would need to be vacated within the day. He had not raised his voice. He had not threatened her. He had simply, with complete administrative efficiency, moved her off the land that mattered. When Edric finally came to me, realizing only then that something had gone badly sideways, I was in the great hall, and it was 2 hours past midday, and she was already gone. I do not have adequate language for what I felt in those first moments. I want to be honest about it. It was not simply frustration at a council member's overreach, though it was that. It was something sharper and more personal, rooted in that warmth in my chest that had not left since the night in the grove, a warmth that had, I understood this only now, been quietly orienting me toward her since the first night I heard her singing, even before I knew what she looked like or what she could do. It was the feeling of something nearly within reach being moved away, and the particular ache of knowing that the moving was my own fault for not going myself. I left the great hall and went to the Northern Grove. The cottage was empty and tidy, swept, the hearth cold, the supplies she had used stacked neatly for the next occupant. She had taken her things and gone without complaint. On the small table near the window she had left a clay jar with a handful of dried herbs standing in it, neatly tied, the way a keeper leaves a good faith gift for the land when they are departing before their work is finished. The jar was labeled in a careful hand, "For the North Meadow bed when the ground thaws." I stood in that empty cottage for a long moment with the jar in my hands. Then I called for my horse. Finding her took the rest of the afternoon and the beginning of evening, because she had not taken the main south road but had gone on foot through the birch wood, which added an hour to any traveler's journey and meant she had left well before Edric came to find me. She was moving steadily and without obvious distress, a person who had been told to go and was going, not running, not lingering either, the practical quiet of someone accustomed to seasons ending early and arrangements changing without ceremony. I caught up to her where the birch wood opened out into the valley trail, at a point where the snow had drifted deep enough that the going was slow. She heard the horse before she saw me. She turned, and her expression in that first moment was careful and unreadable, the face of someone who had learned not to assume that a figure on horseback meant good news. I dismounted. I want to be honest about this moment too. I had been king for 30 years. I had ended border disputes, managed alliances, sat in judgment on matters of life and territory, buried my father and my father's wolf bond and gotten up the next morning and led the pack. I had not, in all that time, stood on a snow-drifted valley trail with my hat in my hand, metaphorically speaking, and been uncertain what to say. I was uncertain now. I said, "I owe you an apology. The summons was mine, and what was done with it was not what I intended, and you should not have been moved from the grove." She looked at me. Her eyes were a clear, still gray-green, the color of water under birch trees in early spring. She did not speak immediately. "You are the Alpha King," she said. It was not a question. It was a careful statement, the kind that leaves room for correction if correction is needed. "I am," I said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "The grove was restricted land. The council steward was not wrong about that." I said, "The council steward was right about the letter of the classification and entirely wrong about what mattered. The northern grove is restricted because of the moon wolf. The moon wolf chose that grove. You were not a problem to be regularized. You were exactly where you needed to be." Something shifted in her expression. Not softened, quite. She was too careful for that, too measured, the expression of someone who had been told comfortable things before and had learned to wait and see if they held. But a question moved across her face that she did not speak aloud. I answered it anyway. "The light came back," I said. "Last night in the grove I watched it." The careful expression did change then, slowly, the way the wolf's light had grown, from inside out. She looked at me with something that was equal parts wonder and relief, the relief of a person who has done a thing they hoped would matter and has just learned that it did. "I only knew the name," she said, "from the old keeper journals. My grandmother had a set. She was a grove keeper all her life in the eastern settlements. I did not know if it was the right one. I did not know if the wolf would receive it." "It did," I said, "more than received it. The bond light is what it was when my mother was alive. Possibly more." She turned that over, then she said quietly, "Your mother." "She was the last one the wolf accepted," I said. "She died 30 years ago." I watched her understand the size of that. 30 years of the wolf circling the northern forest alone. 30 years of the bond light dark. 30 years of a grief the whole pack carried without knowing exactly what shape the grief had. And I watched her receive that understanding with the same quality of attentiveness she had used in the grove. The unhurried stillness of someone who does not rush to respond, because they know that some things deserve to be held a moment before they are answered. "I am sorry," she said, "for the loss, for all of it." It was simply said. It was not a performance of sympathy. It was actual sympathy, offered plainly, from one person to another, without ceremony or calculation. I had been king for 30 years, and I could count on both hands the number of times anyone had offered me condolence for my mother's death and my father's grief, without also calculating what the offer cost them or gained them. "Come back," I said, "to the northern grove. I will have the restricted land designation reviewed and the seasonal assignment reinstated before the day is out." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she looked at the trail behind her, and the trail ahead, and the deepening cold of the evening. "I have already packed," she said. There was the faint trace of something dry in her tone, not quite a complaint, not quite a jest, but somewhere in that quiet territory between the two. "I know," I said. "I am sorry for that too. I should have come myself this morning instead of sending a steward. That was my mistake, and I will not make it again." She seemed to find something in this adequate. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder and looked at me with an expression that was, for the first time, slightly warmer at its edges. "All right," she said. "I will come back." She rode back with me on the horse. She walked, actually, because she said she was fine on her own feet, and the horse had already had a long afternoon, which struck me as characteristic of her in a way I could not have explained yet but recognized immediately. I walked with her, leading the horse, and we went back to the northern grove in the dark. The moon wolf was at the tree line when we arrived. It watched us cross the cleared ground. When she went into the cottage to set her things down again, it did not follow her. It waited, sitting in the snow, as if it had simply come to be present, the way a guard wolf waits at a threshold, not because it has been commanded to, but because it has decided that this is where it belongs. When she came back out and spoke quietly to it in the old moon speech, its tail moved in that same slow, careful arc. It did not come to her hands again that night, but it stayed. It stayed until I left, and when I looked back from the cleared ground, it was still there, a pale shape at the tree line with the silver-blue light just visible in its coat, dim and steady, like an ember kept alive through careful tending. I did not tell my counsel what I had seen. I spent the next 3 days in the archive room and in the grove and in conversation with her, and I want to be clear about the shape of those conversations, because they were not what my counsel would have expected and not, entirely, what I had expected either. She did not speak to me as a king. She spoke to me as a person, with the straightforward practicality of someone who has spent most of their life working and observes the world from that angle, not dismissively, not irreverently, but without the particular kind of deference that people who want something from power tend to offer, and without the particular kind of distance that people who fear power tend to maintain. She simply spoke. About the grove, about the herb beds, about what she had found in her grandmother's keeper journals, about the moon speech and what it preserved and what had been lost from it, about the wolf. She asked me questions and listened to my answers. She offered her own thoughts and did not apologize for having them. On the second afternoon, I brought the water-stained keeper history volume from the archive room and set it on the cottage table, and we spent 2 hours reading sections of it together. She recognized certain phrases in the moon speech sections immediately. She had seen the same syllable patterns in her grandmother's journals and had puzzled out their rough meanings by comparison and context, the way a person who has learned one dialect can sometimes read a neighboring one if they are patient enough. What she had preserved from the journals was partial and imperfect, as she was the first to acknowledge, but partial and imperfect had been enough. The moon wolf, she told me, did not require precision. It required sincerity. The name had to be spoken by someone who meant it, who understood that they were addressing something ancient and worthy of address, and approached it as such. My grandmother always said that the worst thing a keeper could do, she told me, turning a page carefully with ink-stained fingers, was to treat the living things they tended as problems to be managed rather than presences to be received. She said it about groves, about herb beds, about the root systems under winter snow that look dead but are not. She paused. I think she was also saying it about wolves. She was right, I said. She usually was, she said. I did not always appreciate it at the time. I found this, I want to say remarkable, but that is not exactly right. I found it like water after a long journey without it, something necessary, something that I had not fully known I was without until I had it again. The warmth in my chest, which had been present since the night in the grove, did not diminish. It grew slowly, the way the wolf's light had grown. Not urgently, There was nothing frantic in it, but with a steadiness that I had no word for in any language I knew, a steadiness that felt old and rooted, like something that had always been true and was only now being named. On the fourth day, I found her in the herb beds at the north end of the grove, kneeling in the snow to check the condition of the root cover, and the moon wolf was beside her. Not at a distance this time, beside her, close enough that its shoulder was almost at her shoulder, its breath coming in slow, steady plumes in the cold air, the bond light burning in its coat like a full moon reflected on still water. She was talking to it in a low voice, half old moon speech and half ordinary language, the kind of run-together commentary a person offers to a companion when they are working, not expecting answers but pleased by the company. The wolf looked up and saw me, and it did not retreat. It watched me approach. And then, when I was 6 paces away, close enough that I could see the individual details of its face, the silver in the pale coat, the ancient patience in its eyes, it turned its head toward her, and then back to me with a deliberateness that I can only describe as intentional, as if it were making a point. She looked up. She had not heard me approach. "How long has it been doing that?" she asked, meaning the light. 3 days of full burn, I said. It has not dimmed once. She sat back on her heels and looked at the wolf with a complicated expression, fondness, and something careful, and a question she was working out how to ask. "When I was reading my grandmother's journals," she said, "she wrote about the bond light returning once in a settlement far east of here. She wrote that it returned because the one the wolf was waiting for had finally arrived." She paused. "She wrote that the wolf's recognition and the alpha's own bond recognition came from the same source, that when the wolf found the true thread, the alpha's own destined thread would—" She stopped. She looked at her hands in her lap. She was writing about the Eastern Settlement's alpha, not about anyone here. "She was writing about this," I said, "about how it works. It is the same mechanism wherever it happens." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at me with those clear gray-green eyes, and this time there was nothing careful or held back in them. There was simply honesty, and a little uncertainty, and the particular quality of someone who has been surprised by something they are not sure they have understood correctly. "Are you telling me," she said, "that your bond thread—" "Yes," I said, "that is what I am telling you." The silence between us was not awkward. It was full, the way a held breath is full, or the moment before a note is struck, or the first instant of light over the horizon before the sun has cleared the edge of the world. The wolf's bond light pulsed once, gently, as if it were underlining something. She looked at the wolf, and then at me, and she said, "I am a borderland grove keeper. I do not have a pack name or a rank or a title. I have a season's work token and my grandmother's journals, and a practice that travels with me wherever the groves need tending." "I know," I said. "That is not," she seemed to be searching for the right word, "it is not what a king usually—" "I know what it is," I said. "I also know what the wolf knows, and I know what I have felt in my own chest since the night I heard you singing." I paused. "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I am asking whether you are willing to let this be what it is." The wolf raised its great head and rested its chin briefly on her knee, with all the dignified, unsentimental certainty of a creature that has waited 30 years and has now arrived at its conclusion. She laughed. It was a small, quiet laugh, startled out of her by the wolf's timing, and it was the first time I had heard it. A warm, unguarded sound that came without calculation and landed in that space in my chest the way all the right things had been landing since that first night, with the recognition that precedes understanding. "All right," she said for the second time. She said it the same way she had said it on the valley trail, simply, with the weight of a real decision behind it rather than the lightness of an easy one. "All right." I should have told the council myself, that evening, and let it be presented properly. I did not, because what happened instead was that Korath thorough, by the book Korath, who had in the meantime realized that the seasonal assignment he had revoked had been reinstated without his knowledge, and had gone to investigate, arrived at the Grove cottage the following morning with two of his fellow senior advisors, and found the Alpha King of Ashenmore sitting at the keeper's small table, drinking tea, with the Moon Wolf asleep across the threshold. I watched Korath's face go through a sequence of expressions: confusion, recognition, recalculation, and something that was not quite alarm but was adjacent to it. "My lord," he said carefully. "Come in," I said, "both of you." I looked at the third steward who had stayed in the doorway and nodded for him as well. They came in and stood in the small space of the cottage, looking at the wolf asleep in the doorway, and at her. She was at the hearth, standing with her mug, watching them with the same composed, unhurried attentiveness she brought to everything, and then back at me. I said, "You will want to call the full council. I will give you 2 hours." Korath said slowly, "The Moon Wolf." "Yes," I said. He looked at it for a moment longer, the bond light burning steadily in its pale coat, warm silver blue in the morning light, the deep, unhurried breathing of a creature that has come home after a very long absence. Then he looked at her. "The Grove Keeper," he said. His tone was not hostile. It was the tone of a man doing arithmetic that was coming out to an answer he had not expected. "Yes," I said again, 2 hours, Korath." He went. The full council assembled in the great hall with the efficiency of people who understood that something significant had shifted without yet knowing exactly what. And when I walked in, with her beside me and the Moon Wolf at my left shoulder, which drew a silence from the assembled pack advisors and pack elders and senior stewards so complete that I could hear the snow falling outside the high windows, I let the silence hold for a moment before I spoke. I told them everything: the 3 nights at the tree line, the grove, the bond light returning, the warmth in my chest that the oldest keeper histories call the Alpha's bond thread recognizing its match. I did not speak at length. I said what needed to be said, without ornament, as plainly as I could, because I had learned in 30 years of running a pack kingdom that plain words are more convincing than elaborate ones, and because she deserved plain words rather than a performance dressed up as an explanation. I watched their faces as I spoke. The older members of the council, those who had been on it when my mother was alive, who remembered the Moon Wolf's light as something present rather than something absent, went still in a particular way, the stillness of people who are recognizing something they had stopped expecting to ever see again. The younger members watched the wolf. Its bond light burned steadily on the stone floor of the great hall, silver blue against the warm amber of the fire, and the sight of it there, in the hall, where it had not stood in 30 years, where the last time it had entered was the night my mother died and it walked out, was more eloquent than anything I could say. When I was finished, the hall was still quiet. Korath, to his credit, was the first to speak. He said, "The Moonwolf's bond light has not burned for 30 years. "It has burned for 5 days now," I said, "without dimming." He looked at the wolf, which was standing calmly at my side, the silver-blue light moving through its coat like light on water. "The last time the bond light burned at full," Korath said, and his voice was different now, quieter, the voice of a man who was understanding something that had been larger than all of them, all along, "was when your mother was alive." "Yes," I said. The hall was quiet again. One of the pack elders, an old woman named Sura, who had been on the council longer than anyone and whose opinion moved the room when she chose to use it, looked at her. She studied her for a long moment. The plain wool cloak, the keeper's token at her belt, the gray-green eyes that were meeting the old woman's gaze without flinching or performing. "What name do you carry?" Sura asked. She said her name. Her full name, the traveling keeper's name, no pack suffix, no territorial designation, simply her own name, which was all she had ever carried it as and all she had ever needed. Sura was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the wolf and then at me and she said, The wolf chose her. The wolf chose her, I said, and so do I. I am naming her Luna of Ashenmoor. I heard the breath the room took, not a gasp exactly, but the collective intake of people receiving a significant thing and needing a moment to place it correctly. No one spoke against it. I had expected, perhaps, someone to a point of protocol raised, a question about standing or precedent, the kind of careful hesitation that institutional bodies produce when the unexpected arrives. But the wolf's bond light was burning in the middle of the hall. There was, in the end, no argument that could stand in the same room as that light and be taken seriously. Korath stood very still for a moment. I watched him measure the distance between what he had done and what was in front of him now, and to his genuine credit, because he was a man of order and order at its core, meant recognizing what was actually true. He bowed. A proper bow, full and deliberate, the bow that in Ashenmoor's tradition a council member gives to the Alpha King's Luna, a bow that said, "I understand what has happened here and I recognize it." The rest of the council followed. There was no declaration read, no elaborate ceremony. There was simply the hall, and the wolf's light burning steady and warm on the stone floor, and the pack advisors and elders of Ashenmoor bowing to a woman who had arrived 3 weeks earlier with a season's work token and her grandmother's journals, and a voice that could reach into 30 years of silence and call the light back out of it. She stood beside me and received it as she received everything, steadily, without performance, with the full attentiveness of someone who understood what the moment meant and was not going to diminish it by pretending it was ordinary. Afterward, when the council had dispersed and the hall was quieter, Sura stayed. She came to us at the hearth end of the hall, where we had sat down together with the wolf at our feet, and she looked at her for a long moment with the considering expression of a very old woman who has seen many things and is placing this one into its proper context. "The Keeper bloodlines," Sura said, "are older than the Pack kingdoms, older than the Alpha lines. The covenant with the Moon Wolf predates all of it." She paused. "There are those who will ask why the Bond chose a borderland keeper and not a pack-born woman." "There are always those who will ask the wrong question," I said. Sura allowed herself a small, dry smile. "True." She looked at her again. "The right question is why the Bond waited 30 years and chose now." She said quietly, "I do not know that I can answer that. I only did what my grandmother's journals described. I learned the name. I came when the groves needed tending. I did not plan any of the rest of it." "That is generally how these things work," Sura said, with a tone that was not unkind. "The Bond does not wait for plans." In the weeks that followed, there were adjustments to be made. Ashenmoor was a large and complex pack kingdom, and introducing a new Luna was not a small administrative event. There were those in the Pack Council who took longer than others to recalibrate their understanding. There were questions about precedent and protocol, and the formal structure of the Keeper bloodline's relationship to the Pack governance. I dealt with those questions with the straightforward clarity that I had found in 30 years of ruling was the most efficient approach to institutional resistance. I was patient, I was specific, and when I needed to be, I was final. What I had not anticipated, and what I should have, because the evidence was everywhere from the beginning, was that most of the recalibration the Pack needed did not require much pushing from me. It required only time and proximity. The wolf's bond light burned every day in the northern grove, visible from the stone hall's north-facing windows, a quiet and unhurried argument that no council debate could effectively counter. Pack members who had spent 30 years walking carefully around the absence of that light found themselves, without ceremony, without announcement, simply watching it burn, and feeling something ease in the kingdom's collective chest that they had not fully realized was tight. She spent most of those weeks in the northern grove, which was where she was most herself and where the wolf was steadiest. She was also, in those weeks, learning the shape of Ashenmoor, its people, its rhythms, its history, with the same unhurried attentiveness she brought to everything. She asked questions. She listened. She did not attempt to rush any of it or perform competence she was still building. There was a day, perhaps 2 weeks after the naming, when I found her in the Great Hall's archive room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with 3 of the oldest keeper history volumes open around her, and one of my younger scribes, a 17-year-old who had joined the archive staff 6 months earlier, and had not yet fully learned to relax around the Alpha King, sitting across from her, equally cross-legged, helping her compare a passage in the Moon Speech records to a parallel passage in the old Pact Covenant texts, both of them deeply absorbed in the work, and both of them, I noticed, talking with an ease that suggested the scribe had entirely forgotten to be nervous. I stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. She looked up. She had a smear of old ink on her right hand, apparently from the pages, and her hair was loose the way it always was when she was working, and she looked in that moment entirely at home in a room she had never been in before I named her Luna of Ashenmore, surrounded by documents that had been waiting for someone who could read them properly for more years than she had been alive. "There is a second moon name," she said without preamble, "in these records, not the one I used, an older one. The keeper history suggests it is the wolf's name in full. The one I used is a familiar form, a shortened address." She held up the volume in question. "Did you know this?" "I did not," I said. She looked pleased, not with herself exactly, but with the discovery, which was where her satisfaction consistently lived. "I want to try it," she said, "when the wolf is ready. Not yet, but eventually." "Tell me when you want to go," I said. "I would like to be there." She smiled at me, that smile I had been gathering like a miser since the night on the valley trail, the one that came without calculation and landed in my chest with the warmth of something rightfully home, and said, "You are always there." "I always will be," I said. The young scribe, to his credit, found something very interesting in the middle distance and did not comment. That spring, when the snow left the northern grove and the herb beds came up green under the birch trees, the moonwolf walked out of the northern forest for the first time since my father's reign and lay down in the new grass at the grove's center, in the full morning sunlight, with its bond light burning silver blue against the green and the pale birch trunks around it. She sat beside it in the grass, with her grandmother's journals open in her lap, and I sat beside her, and Ashenmore's pack elders came, one by one through the morning, to see the thing that 30 years of grief and 30 years of waiting had finally yielded up. The wolf's light moved in the morning air like something breathing. It had waited, the old keeper histories said, until the one it recognized arrived. It had known true thread when it found it, the way water knows where to run, and it had led both of us, with the patient, unhurried certainty of a creature that does not doubt what it knows, to the place where all the right things came home at once. Her hands rested on the wolf's back, warm and steady. Mine rested over hers. The light ran through all 3 of us together, wolf to keeper to king, king to keeper to wolf, the circle of it completed at last, and the grove around us was green and the sky above was bright, and the long grief of Ashenmore was over. I have been asked since whether I would have found her if the wolf had not led me to the grove, whether the bond thread would have recognized her without the wolf's light as the signal, whether any of it would have happened if Korath had simply let her stay where she was assigned, in the ordinary way of things. I do not know the answer to most of those questions. I know that the wolf did not bring her to Ashenmore. She came on her own, drawn by the work, drawn by the winter groves that needed a keeper's hands, drawn by the ordinary pull of a livelihood that had been hers long before any of this began. The wolf found her because she was already there. The bond found me because the wolf found her. And I found her because I had the habit, on sleepless nights, of going to the tree line to watch the wolf, which is to say, ultimately, because I had never stopped hoping, even in the years when I was most careful not to call it hope. What I know is this: she was tending a grove she had been hired to tend, on land she had come to in the ordinary course of her work, and she had done what her grandmother's journals described because she had learned it carefully, and because she cared about the living things the practice asked her to care for. She had not come to Ashenmore looking for a bond or a king or a destiny. She had come because the northern grove needed a keeper in winter, and she was one. That is true thread. That is what the wolf was waiting for. Not greatness of the performed kind, not a woman who arrived knowing she was destined for something extraordinary and shaped herself to fit it. A woman who arrived doing her work, who spoke gently to the things around her, who kept her grandmother's journals and never thought to discard them even in the years when the knowledge in them had no obvious use, who stood in a dark grove at the second hour past midnight with her hands held open and spoke a name into the cold with the steady, simple expectation that if a thing needed to be done, the right way to do it was to do it well. Every morning since, the moonwolf comes to the grove threshold before sunrise. It waits there, patient and still, in the silver blue of its own light until she comes out. She speaks to it in the moon speech, briefly, the greeting that the old keeper records call the dawn word, a handful of syllables that mean, as nearly as I can translate them, I am here and you are here and we are well. The wolf presses its head briefly into her hands. The light burns steady, and then the day begins. I have been Alpha King of Ashenmore for 30 years without that light, and with it, the whole kingdom feels different, fuller, warmer. The way a hearth feels different when the fire is lit versus when the hearth is cold, but the room is otherwise unchanged. My pack feels it too. My advisors have mostly made their peace with it. Even Korath, who is not a sentimental man, told me once, simply and without elaboration, that the northern grove seemed like a different place than it was before, and that this was a good thing. She is Luna of Ashenmore, and the bond light burns, and the wolf sleeps at our threshold, and the keeper bloodlines and the alpha line are woven back together the way the old covenant always intended. I did not plan any of it. I only went to the tree line on a cold night because I could not sleep, and heard someone singing, and watched a wolf stop in its 30-year circling and sit down and listen. All of it began there in the dark, in the cold, with a melody I did not know and a light that had only just learned, after a very long wait, how to come home.